Welcome to another edition of This Day in History here on the GoodMicWork channel. I am your host, Greg Morgan. It has been over a year since I've given you guys a This Day in History video. This was a segment that I started nearly 3 years ago now, and I've done a grand total of, count 'em, 8 episodes, including this one. So obviously, these are extremely infrequent, and it was very hard to keep up with this series, and it wasn't going to be something I was going to be able to do a couple of times a month. So I made a little internal rule with myself last year that I was going to reserve this series on my channel for big anniversaries, 10-year, 20-year, 30-year type of stuff. And that's what I've done in my past few videos. Next month on November 9th, you're going to get another 20-year This Day in History video on arguably the biggest story in the history of professional wrestling. So stay tuned for that next month. As far as this episode goes, it's a big one. As you can see the date here on the screen, October 5th, 1997. A lot was going on in the wrestling business during this time, and the 3 major events that took place on this date, we will be chronicling all of that in this episode, and even an event that took place on October 5th, 1999, I will give some opinions on as well. So before we get into all this here, I just want to welcome all of the first-time listeners or newer subscribers to the channel. If you have not yet subscribed, please do so. If you enjoy this video, give that like button a click and help me out. Follow me on social media. I'm at GoodMicWork on Twitter, extremely active on Twitter. I also have a Facebook page. Give that a like if you don't mind. The links to all of the stuff that I'm mentioning are in the description below. Also, I have a website, GoodMicWorkCommentaries.com. You can download this episode in podcast form if you would like to listen to it that way. And you can also find me on iTunes and Stitcher Radio. Also, for you diehard listeners, I don't know if you've noticed, but I never number these episodes. When it comes to my This Day in Histories, for some reason when I started them, I didn't include them in my episode count. So I figured I would just keep that trend going, and this is just a little bonus series on the channel that I really don't count as actual episodes. So my episode count is not going to go up after this video. Not really sure why I made that decision 3 years ago, but it's a decision that I feel I need to stick with now, so no big deal there. But I did want to let a few of you know who might have been curious. As far as what we're going to get into tonight, like I said, October 5th, 1997, that's going to be the majority of this commentary. That's what we're going to talk about. This day is a day that I remember fondly. It has now been 20 years since the death of Brian Pillman. I have talked about Brian many times in the past throughout the years in Q&As and random commentaries. You know, his name has come up a lot. And so a lot of you might know my opinions on his death and how it affected me. To me, Brian Pillman's death is what started the massive snowball of wrestling deaths. We had experienced some tragedies prior to Brian. We had Eddie Gilbert passing away. We had the murder of Bruiser Brody. We had seen a few deaths throughout the years prior to this point, but nothing like what would happen after Brian Pillman's death. Once Pillman died, it seemed like guys were dying left and right. If you fast forward 5 years past 1997 and get to 2003, think of the names we lost in that 5-year span. Just to name a few off the top of my head, I have nothing written down, but I know we lost Mr. Perfect, British Bulldog, Ravishing Rick Rude, Louis Spicolli, Owen Hart, Miss Elizabeth, Stu Hart, Road Warrior Hawk, Crash Holly, all sorts of names. And it just got worse after that. Year after year, we just kept losing dozens of former wrestlers, and it was crazy. And it seemed like it all started with Brian Pillman. But my memories of Brian dying were huge because I was an enormous Brian Pillman fan. I've talked about him so many times in his days in WCW. Flying Brian, this guy trained in Calgary, and he was so ridiculously athletic, being a former football player and just being an all-around great athlete as it was. He transitioned really well into professional wrestling, and when you go back and watch some of the stuff he was doing in the late 80s and early 90s, you say to yourself, God damn, this guy really invented a lot of the high-flying moves that you see today. He was one of the first guys to do this stuff. Before him, we had a lot of high flyers. We had the Rockers and we had Randy Savage and guys like that, but nobody could do the high-flying stuff with the level of athleticism that Brian Pillman had, and he was so fun to watch. And back in those days, the early days of WCW, when they broke away from the NWA and Ted Turner turned him into WCW, you know, Pillman was a big part of that, and I have a lot of memories watching him on Saturday nights and all of the great things he could do, whether he was an enhancement talent or whether they were giving him a push. He was doing a great job. His heel turn turned out to be one of the greatest things they ever did with him. He started out as a heel in WCW when he was teaming with Steve Austin, Stunning Steve Austin as the Hollywood Blondes, and they were probably my favorite tag team in WCW, possibly ever. You know, I know you can lump in the Steiners and the Road Warriors and teams like that, but they also went through the WWE. As far as a WCW exclusive tag team, Brian Pillman and Steve Austin were amazing to watch and incredibly entertaining. And they gelled really well. I know Austin's told stories countless times of how they got together, and he wasn't expecting to be teamed with Brian Pillman, and he kind of rejected it at first. But once they embraced it and really tried their best to become a top team in WCW, they killed it. I mean, they were so entertaining, and they were very creative, and it sucks that they were held back. They could have been huge. If they would have gotten over even more and WCW wouldn't have broken them up, they could have came in as a team to the WWE and became a very decorated tag team in WWE history. I mean, we might not have even gotten Stone Cold Steve Austin if that scenario would have played out. So I thought they were a good enough team to succeed even in WWE. Political bullshit during that time in WCW broke them up, and Brian Pillman kind of went off on his own, and then within a few years, he started developing that loose cannon persona. He was a member of the Four Horsemen, and he was just completely crazy. And a lot of people that he worked with, a lot of his fellow wrestlers had no idea if he was working or not, or if he was shooting half the time. I mean, he was really that good, and I think he loved keeping people guessing, and he embraced that loose cannon type persona to where you never knew what the hell he was going to do from week to week. He was acting very eccentric and very erratic and very crazy, and he started creating a lot of buzz for himself. And then he started having issues with WCW. Next thing you know, he turns up in ECW in one of my favorite debuts ever for a wrestler into a promotion, the way he showed up, and all the fans kind of knew he was going to be there, and they expected to see him. And then he grabbed the mic and turned heel on everybody. That was an amazing moment in pro wrestling. If you've never seen Brian Pillman's debut in ECW, go check it out. I'm sure it's on the network. I'm sure it's on YouTube. You can find it somewhere, and it's a really fun debut. And it really illustrates and shows you how good of a heel Brian Pillman could be, and how great he was on the mic, and what a great look and feel he had during that time. Brian Pillman was tailor-made for that mid-90s attitude type of era. Unfortunately, before his debut in ECW, he suffered a horrific car accident, and he completely shattered his ankle into a million pieces. Physically, he was never the same again. His days of being an athletic in-ring worker were gone. He was going to have to rely on persona only, and he really shouldn't have ever wrestled again at all. He was in no shape to do it. He was in constant pain. His ankle literally was shattered, and with all of the metal and screws and multiple surgeries he had on his leg, he was never able to return to form. I still found myself being incredibly entertained by Brian Pillman because he was such a good character. And then when he came into the WWE, he was immediately that loose cannon character. They didn't really know what to do with him because he was still on crutches. He was still nursing the injury. So they were using him as an interview guy, and he would do a few crazy things. And I loved the King of the Ring 1996, where he cut the promo talking about rape and pillaging and plundering the entire federation, and then he walked back to the aisle as Stone Cold Steve Austin was making his entrance, and the two of them passed each other in the aisleway and kind of looked at each other. I loved that moment. They never really would team back up together. Ironically, in the last This Day in History video that I did a year ago when I talked about Mind Games in 1996, Brian Pillman and Steve Austin were kind of on the same page for that pay-per-view when Pillman interviewed Owen Hart and Steve Austin, and the three of them were out there shitting on Bret Hart. That was actually a lot of fun, but right after that, they ran the angle where Austin attacked Brian Pillman, injuring his leg and writing him off of TV so he could go have yet another ankle surgery. And then he came back like a year later, joined up with the Hart Foundation, and when he came back, I loved his role in the Hart Foundation. He looked good there. He's always that loose cannon in the group. He did the same thing with the Four Horsemen. With the Hart Foundation, he was kind of that wild card. For a while, they really weren't even including him into the Hart Foundation. He was just their friend. He didn't have the Hart Foundation jacket like all the other guys did. Jim Neidhart was in and out, but he was not as cohesive and close, I don't think, as the Bulldog Owen and Bret were. But for him to be a part of that group, I loved it because it allowed him to shine on the mic. And with the Hart Foundation being a faction, you can kind of put Brian Pillman in matches now. They did the big 10-man tag, which is one of the biggest pay-per-view matches and most fun pay-per-views in WWE history at Calgary Stampede back in the summer of this same year. And Brian Pillman was involved in that, and he had a couple of singles matches, but really that ankle injury completely tied him down, and he wasn't able to do much. His final feud, of course, was with Goldust when they were battling over Marlena. Brian Pillman had to wear a dress after he lost at SummerSlam, and then I believe he won the next match at the next pay-per-view, which gave him custody of Marlena, if you can believe that. And she had to join him on the road for 30 days, and he turned her all gothic and dressed her up in like slutty dominatrix gear and all of that. It was pretty funny stuff. And right in the middle of that angle is when everything went down with Brian Pillman right before the Bad Blood pay-per-view. I remember watching that night. I still have the original broadcast on VHS tape, complete with the free-for-all on the preview channel and the whole deal. And I remember my buddy came over, the same guy that would watch literally every pay-per-view with me during this time. He showed up right before the show came on. We turned on the preview guide or wherever it was and watched the free-for-all, and that's when we saw Vince McMahon make the announcement that Brian Pillman had passed away, and we were shocked. I couldn't believe it. I believe he passed away in Minneapolis or St. Paul, maybe. I forgot where he was. I think it was Bloomington, actually. I want to say Bloomington, but I know he had worked a house show loop around the St. Paul and Minneapolis area and came through there and passed away in the hotel room in Bloomington. I think he had a heart attack or whatever it was, and it was shocking. And it was just very odd during this time how the WWE handled this, because they would get better at this over the years. I mean, they endured so many deaths that they handled many of them in the future a lot better. But this first one, they kind of botched. And Vince McMahon, I remember even on commentary, the next night on Raw even, was one of the craziest nights and the saltiest nights on commentary I can remember the WWE being. I think Vince McMahon was upset about the death of Brian Pillman. I think that he automatically assumed it was a drug overdose. And we know that Brian Pillman definitely had some drug issues. And Vince McMahon was being very, almost aggressive. I remember when he was talking about Brian Pillman, he brought up drugs, and he goes, whether it's, prescription or recreational, it's not acceptable, or whatever he said something to that effect, where I was like, wow, Vince seems really upset over this Brian Pillman death. He almost seems pissed off more than sad. And the next night on Raw, they also had the very uncomfortable and odd and strange interview with Brian Pillman's widow, Melanie Pillman, one day after he dies. They have her live via satellite doing an interview on Raw. And it's just dark. I don't even know how to describe it. I know something like this is probably not on the network. Well, it might be if they have all the Raws up there. I'm not sure. Otherwise, check YouTube. And for those of you who haven't seen it, you'll see what I'm talking about. It's just very strange. Why would they even call her and bring her on the show? And I remember Vince even asking her if she knew anything or knew any signs that would, tell her that Brian Pillman was in some trouble. He was just asking her very awkward, uncomfortable questions. And they had a weird marriage too. I'm pretty sure they were probably both unfaithful to each other. Every time I saw Brian Pillman interact with Sunny on WWE TV, I was 100% convinced that they fucked before. There was just something about it. And just the way the whole interview went down, it was an extremely poor taste, I think, of the WWE to bring her on that close after Brian Pillman died in that state that she's in. And she's just kind of sitting there funny on a couch with her head in her hand, and she just... the interview goes nowhere. It's almost just like they did this shit for ratings or whatever it was. It's just really bizarre, and it was uncomfortable, and I didn't like it. That's also the same night. I know we're going into the next day here on October 6th, but that's the first time I ever heard Vince McMahon on TV acknowledge WCW. That's the night that Shawn Michaels and Triple H showed the curtain call on the Titantron, another This Day in History 20-year anniversary that I did about a year and a half ago. Check the playlist if you want to hear that, which was insane. A year and a half after that, they're showing it on the fucking Titantron. So that was just an odd night of television. Vince McMahon seemed like he was a different person. I don't remember him being on TV or being the Raw announcer after that. He might have been there one more week, and then he was off, never to be seen again. So it's one of Vince McMahon's last Raw broadcast, and it was his last pay-per-view broadcast at Bad Blood. So as you can tell here, there's just a lot going on during this time. And thinking about what it must have been like to be in the locker room when the news broke of Brian Pillman's death, I think Sunny was interviewing somebody on the free-for-all, and you could tell she had been crying. He had a lot of friends backstage. I know guys like Jim Cornette and Jim Ross and other people that worked with him in WCW. Steve Austin is another guy. His Hart Foundation brothers, of course. People that he's known for years, training with the Hart family ever since he started. So he had a lot of friends and a lot of brothers in that locker room. And it was probably pretty hard for those guys to go out there and work a pay-per-view right after hearing the news of him dying. But it turned out to be one of the most memorable pay-per-views in WWE history. So I just want to give a heartfelt rest in peace to Brian Pillman. I cannot believe that he's been dead for 20 years now. That blows my mind. His death kind of still seems fresh to me because I was a 20-year-old man during that time when that was going on. And I have mostly fond memories, aside from the deaths, of that time period. And 1997 itself was one of my favorite years in WWE because they started catching up a little bit to WCW. They had a great summer in that run with the Hart Foundation against USA, and Stone Cold Steve Austin was getting on the map. There was so much going on that was positive. The great Bret Hart Stone Cold match at WrestleMania earlier that year. There was a lot going on, and WWE seemed to be the most interesting it had been in quite a while. And then to be hit with a blow like that, a devastating death, one of your top personalities on your roster passes away unexpectedly. WWE could definitely have handled it better, to say the very least. But Brian Pillman was one of my favorites of all time, whether it was in the ring or on the microphone or his look or his persona or his attitude or whatever it was. I literally feel like I loved everything about the guy. What I wouldn't give to be a wrestler in the business with the look and the athletic ability that he possessed. That would have been money in the bank. One of the things I've always remembered the most about Brian Pillman's death is when they were tributing him with the video package on Raw. Jim Ross opened up the whole thing by saying Brian Pillman lost his battle with life, because that's literally what he did. He battled throughout his entire life, not only from that horrific car accident that he was in that adversely affected his career and shortened it a lot, but also the fact that he was born with throat cancer. He had like 40 some odd surgeries as a kid. That's why he had that raspy voice, because his vocal cords were a mess from the countless surgeries and removing tumors and all of that. So Brian Pillman was met with adversity at every turn, and he fought as long as he could. And finally, in 1997, he succumbed to the battles with life, and he's no longer with us. But man, he was a riot. There was nobody like Brian Pillman. For you younger fans that aren't familiar with him, just watch his stuff, YouTube him, watch him in the ring in his early days, watch him later on in his career when he started developing his personality and his persona, and how crazy and how nuts he could be on the mic, and how there were so many times in WCW, ECW, and WWE that you didn't know if he was shooting or not. And not too many guys can pull that off. So rest in peace, Brian Pillman. You are sorely, sorely missed. Let's get into Bad Blood now. I've been rambling on about Brian Pillman for so long. I originally only intended to spend about 5 minutes on the guy, but as per usual with me, whenever I say 5 minutes, I usually mean 20. But anyway, Bad Blood came to us from St. Louis, Missouri. This was at the Kiel Center, and St. Louis is a big wrestling town, and one of the things I remember the most about this show is how many fucking people were there. I'm pretty sure that this was a sellout. This was somewhere in the neighborhood of 17 to 20,000 people in 1997. Was a pretty awesome house for the WWE to draw, especially when there was no really singles titles defended on this show. I mean, Shawn Michaels' European title was not up for grabs in the Hell in the Cell, and Bret Hart, WWE champion at the time, worked a tag team match. The only title change I think we saw was Owen Hart. I think that was the culmination of the Intercontinental title tournament, and Owen Hart won the belt back. But other than that, we didn't see a whole lot on the show. This show was really about two things. It was about the Hell in the Cell match between Shawn Michaels and The Undertaker, and it was about the debut of Kane. This turned out to be so much better than I thought. When they were hyping this match and everything, I thought it was going to be good, don't get me wrong, but I didn't think it would be as memorable as it was, and I kind of thought it might be a one-time only thing, not something that they would do 40 or 50 times now. The Hell in the Cell was an extremely successful concept for them, and I don't know if it would have been that successful had The Undertaker and Shawn Michaels not torn the house down in the very first one. There is so much shit surrounding the Shawn Michaels and Undertaker situation around this time. I mean, there was a lot of turmoil going on in the WWE, not only in front of the camera, but behind the camera. Shawn Michaels had recently turned heel at SummerSlam in the match with Bret Hart and The Undertaker, when Bret Hart won the WWE title. Fast forward a few weeks later, Shawn Michaels is now a heel. He started to align himself with Triple H. At the constant request of both of them and the constant pestering of Vince McMahon to put them together, he finally agrees. They kind of form a little heel alliance here. And then he goes into the UK one night only, an England only pay-per-view, and he beats Davey Boy Smith, wins the European title when he's supposed to lose. He's not supposed to win this match, but he pulls his political power and his political bullshit and ends up defeating Davey Boy right in front of his hometown and his family for the European title, which is still fucked up when I think about it. Here we go again. I'm going to mention another This Day in History, the one I did last year, September 22nd. That Raw in Madison Square Garden is when Vince McMahon not only got stunned by Stone Cold Steve Austin during the show, but before the show, he called Bret Hart into a meeting and said that he wanted to end his contract and for Bret to call up WCW and try to get that old deal that they offered him a year before, and he basically is forcing Bret Hart out. So that's kind of where we're at here with the storyline. So I remember on TV, they were doing this match with Shawn Michaels and The Undertaker. After the heel turn at SummerSlam, they had worked at Ground Zero. And I forgot how that match ended, but Shawn ended up running away or whatever it was. So they decided to confine these guys in the Hell in the Cell. And this was also a #1 contenders match. The winner of this match would challenge Bret Hart for the title at Survivor Series. So that's kind of your setup here. Not only is it a #1 contenders match, high stakes in this match, but it's also kind of the blow-off of the feud between Shawn Michaels and The Undertaker, sort of. They would go on to work again at the Royal Rumble in the casket match, in a match that ended Shawn Michaels' career for 4.5 years, but really, this Hell in the Cell was going to kind of be the blow-off because Undertaker was going to be moving on to another opponent, namely his brother. So the two guys go in there. For those of you who have not seen this match, I'm sure anybody who is a WWE fan has seen the very first ever Hell in the Cell. Even if you're 12 years old, you've probably seen this match. If not, get your ass on the WWE Network, pause this commentary right now, go watch that match, and then come back to it. And you will see some amazing stuff, or at least amazing stuff for the time. I don't know, watching it back, how it would hold up to recent Hell in the Cell matches we've seen with Shane McMahon diving off and shit like that. But, you know, for this very first one, I thought it was very good. It was brutal. They started out in the middle of the ring and fought on the outside of the ring and did a lot of fun, innovative spots on the outside. We didn't know what they were really going to do with this giant cage, but they slammed each other into it, and Shawn Michaels was climbing up and dropping elbows off of it, and they were doing some innovative stuff. And then they found a way to get out of the ring. Shawn Michaels, I think, beats up a cameraman. They have to open the door to get him medical attention, and that's when Shawn sneaks out. Undertaker follows him out, slingshots him into the cage. Shawn Michaels gets a ton of color, starts scaling the cage, climbs up to the roof. I never thought we would see these two guys on the roof. Shawn is getting his ass kicked up there, and as he's trying to climb down the cage, he's about halfway down. Undertaker stomps his hands, and he falls about, 8 feet through the announce table on the outside of the ring. And that spot, for the time, I remember being blown away by it. We would see a lot crazier less than a year later when Mick Foley would go Peter Panning off the fucking top of it. But that bump that Shawn took was no joke, and he was up there a pretty good ways, and he came flying down on that announce table and took a beating. And I think the sickest shot in the whole match was at the very end with the chair shot. You guys all know the chair shot I'm talking about. Undertaker and Shawn are back in the cell at this point. They've got a chair in the ring. They're both using it. And finally, Undertaker gets his hands on it and picks it up and cracks Shawn Michaels across the skull so hard. I mean, Shawn just immediately hits the mat like a ton of bricks, sold it beautifully, a disgusting, sickening thud, as JR would say. And that was it for Shawn. He was completely dead, unconscious. A finger on the chest would have pinned him for a count of 100. And as soon as Undertaker's about to finish him off, the lights go out. The music comes on, the fireworks go off, and out comes Paul Bearer with this fucking monster, the big red machine Kane. We all remember the line by Vince, "That's gotta be Kane, that's gotta be Kane." That is etched in every wrestling fan's brain until the end of time, I guarantee you. Pretty iconic debut by Kane. And a lot of fans knew it, and that's why I appreciated how good this match was, because we knew Paul Bearer had been hyping up Kane for months. This dated back all the way to the summer. So really, what better way, or what better place, I should say, to debut Kane than in this Hell in the Cell, because it gives Shawn Michaels the victory and moves him on to Bret, a match that WWE really wants to have, and it gets him out of that whole deal with The Undertaker and that whole feud, and it allows The Undertaker to lose without really losing face, because he was attacked by a monster, by his brother that he thought was dead for the past 25 years or whatever. So Kane coming in and standing face to face with The Undertaker was a pretty iconic moment. He does the firework thing and then ends up picking up The Undertaker and hitting him with a tombstone. Kane was still trying to figure out the tombstone around this time, so it wasn't perfect. He would develop his own kind of style of doing it. He was in his infancy here. This is the first time we saw him, so his mannerisms and his abilities would get better over time. But this very first confrontation turned out very well, and it worked really well. And I wasn't really sure about the Kane character. When Paul Bearer was hyping it, I was like, well, shit, who are they going to get to be Kane? Because by then, the internet's really not in full effect yet, but you got dirt sheets and you got newsletters and you have things like that. And word was out. We knew months before that Kane, or Glenn Jacobs, or Isaac Yankem, I should say, was going to be the guy to portray Kane. And given his track record, I wasn't too thrilled about it. I thought he was a good choice because he was super ugly, and I remember him as Unabomb, and I thought that he could definitely play that creepy type of character, but I had no idea it was going to be this good. I thought it was going to be a short-lived type of deal. I thought it was going to be a Giant Gonzalez type of deal where he comes in, works a program, and then he leaves. But Kane stuck around, and now here we are 20 years later, and Kane technically has not retired yet. He's off doing his own political thing, has not been on WWE TV in a while. I expect him to come back and do some sort of a send-off. A guy like Kane, you can't just quietly retire. You got to do something. But that's a different story, another story for another time. We can debate that sometime down the road. But the longevity of Kane's career and how great he turned out to be, he found his niche with that character because Glenn was always good in the ring. And he got really good as Kane. He had some iconic matches with The Undertaker, with Mankind, with Steve Austin during the Attitude Era. Later on in his career, he would work with Triple H. He would work with everybody. And he would hold a lot of titles in the WWE, especially in those early days. Tag Team Champion, Intercontinental Champion. Changed his look up a couple of times. Probably one of my biggest regrets with the Kane character is how they unmasked him in 2003. Wasn't a huge fan of that. Kind of wish they would have held off the unmasking for down the road. You kind of have to unmask Kane at some point just because of, you just have to, in my opinion. So I knew the unmasking was going to come. I just didn't really like the way they did it in 2003, but Kane embraced it, shaved his head, went with that look instead, went on to win world titles under that particular gimmick without the mask. He would then put the mask back on later on, around 2011, 2012, something like that, when he returned with the welder's mask and kind of went back to his old ways. And then he evolved into Corporate Kane, which everybody hated Corporate Kane, but I actually liked him. I thought he was very good in that role. I loved when he would speak the corporate language on the microphone and talking about assessing people's performances and just talking like one of those corporate snobs. He was very good at it, and that's how versatile Glenn Jacobs is. When you look back to his gimmicks that he had on the independent circuit, into WWE, under his various personas, now is Kane, and then very different variations of Kane. The guy did a pretty good job of making the best of the gimmicks and characters that he was given, and reinvented himself, on an Undertaker level. Not as good as The Undertaker, because not all of Kane's looks have been home runs, but he's definitely kept himself relevant for a long time. This is probably the most irrelevant he's ever been in the past couple of years when he's been in and out of Corporate Kane and Demon Kane, and a lot of that was stupid. But as far as his longevity goes, you got to hand it to the guy. Much like Mark Henry, he's not doing a whole lot right now in today's day and age in 2017, but he's been in the company 21 years, on the roster as a performer for 21 years. If you were born during his debut, you are now old enough to drink. Think about that. That's mind-blowing. So it's a long time for Kane to be in the business, and 20 years now as that character is pretty incredible, and it's an amazing accomplishment. And he's been in the business itself longer than that, like I've said. He worked all over the place in the independents. He even stopped in WCW and worked a couple of matches there, and of course was Isaac Yankem in WWE. And how can we ever forget New Diesel? He was actually brought in to be Kevin Nash's replacement, along with Rick Bogner from Japan, who played Razor Ramon. And it was a horrible gimmick, and it failed miserably, but he's done a lot of stuff, and he's tried his best with it. So Kane has always had an awesome look. I thought he was a lot better in the ring than Sid Vicious, or Psycho Sid, whatever you want to call him. But I thought Sid had a better look to him. I thought he looked like more of a champion than Glenn, even though Glenn was a better wrestler. So it just kind of depends. Yeah, it's all about right time, right place for a lot of guys, and I think it's pretty safe to say that Glenn Jacobs was in the right time and the right place for this Kane gimmick, because much like The Undertaker, this very same gimmick on anybody else might not have worked, might not have been as good, might have failed. But Mark Calloway and Glenn Jacobs did unbelievable work with these gimmicks, and they became a huge part of WWE's legacy. The Undertaker and Kane, those are statue-worthy guys. In 20 years from now, when little kids are learning about these great legends and The Undertaker, what? The Undertaker had a brother? I didn't know that. His name was Kane? Holy shit. Just think about what the next generation can learn about gimmicks like this and how things used to be during this time in the WWE, and provided a individual gives everything he can to a gimmick or character, you can make it work. And Glenn Jacobs definitely made Kane work, and I'm very proud of that gimmick and that character and its history in the WWE. It wasn't all perfect. Like I said, Kane had some problems. There was a lot of stuff that Kane was involved in that I didn't like. But his overall career, his accomplishments, his championships, his longevity as a character, I respect and admire that so much. And anybody that can be relevant and stay in the same gimmick for that long deserves to be commended. There's not many guys that can say that. Guys like The Undertaker, guys like Kane, guys like Sting, gimmicks like that were so iconic and were around for 20 plus years. So hopefully, whatever the future holds for Cain, I hope his political career works out for him. But whenever he decides to return to the WWE in whatever form or fashion, I really hope that we get some sort of a send-off for Cain. I think it's about time for him to retire. It doesn't have to be much. He can come in and work for 4 weeks and just build something random up, have a retirement match, and let us all say goodbye to Cain one last time before he retires. So Glenn Jacobs, if you're listening, which I know you're not, please come back and give us a little send-off before you move on with your life, because I know you have a lot of outside interests and you're very successful. And I've talked about this before too, about a lot of guys, about guys like Brock Lesnar and Chris Jericho and other talents that have outside interests other than the WWE. They don't put all their eggs in one basket. They have a life outside of that wrestling ring. Chris Jericho with Fozzy, Brock Lesnar with football or UFC and all the things he's done. Even guys like JBL with all of his businesses and his charities and shit like that. Whenever somebody doesn't have to rely on the WWE to make their living, that's when I feel like I respect them the most. They don't let the WWE have them by the balls. They make their own way, they make their own decisions, and they will give WWE their time when it's convenient for them, not the other way around. So certain guys can get to that point in their career, and Cain is one of those guys. So hats off to you, man, on a hell of a run. I mean, Cain had a hell of a run. And I think we can all agree on that. So if you're looking for something to do tonight and you're bored, go online, go on WWE Network, go on YouTube, go on the internet, look up Cain matches, look up Cain moments. It might be a fun thing to do to commemorate his 20 years in the business. So that was a pretty big day. Like I said, I think we covered a lot of ground there for this day in 1997, especially storyline-wise with what was going on with everybody and all the circumstances around Brian Pillman's death and what was going on in the WWE and their war with WCW and Bret Hart leaving and all this shit going on. It was a very traumatic time in wrestling, and it was crazy, man. 1997 was a crazy year. And before I get out of here, I would feel bad if I didn't mention this. As I was doing the preparation for this episode, I did realize that it's also another anniversary. October 5th, 2 years later in 1999, marks the anniversary of the injury to Droz. This was when Droz was paralyzed in the ring, I believe on SmackDown, against D'Lo Brown. And still such a tragic thing when you go back and think about that. Luckily, this was never shown on camera. This was a taped show. I know footage of this exists, but I don't think it's anywhere that you can find. I think WWE has it, and it's locked in the vault. But during the match, I think D'Lo was going for his running power bomb, which we saw him do in a lot of matches, and something went wrong. Droz landed right on his head and broke his neck, and he was paralyzed from like the neck down, and he's been confined to a wheelchair ever since. It was 18 years ago when that happened to him. And he had some potential, man. We remember how he came in as Puke. He had that iconic appearance in Beyond the Mat with Vince McMahon. He's gonna puke. He's gonna puke. We all remember that. And Droz, you know, he had a good look. He was a little bit different, but pretty good and a pretty good fit for the Attitude Era during that time. And I thought had a lot of potential. Wasn't a big fan of a lot of the stuff he was doing with the Legion of Doom and being the enabler of Hawk and all of that stuff, but I still thought the guy on the surface had a lot of potential and could be a big star in the WWE, and I feel horrible that it all went downhill for him. But I'll tell you why I admire Darren Drozdov the most, is because he made the best of it. He held no grudges at all. He had no ill feelings towards D'Lo Brown. He knew it was an accident. He remained positive throughout the whole thing and remains positive to this day. I do think WWE took care of him. They did have some sort of lawsuit, or they had to settle with him and take care of him, and they gave him a bunch of money, which they should. And over the years, he's been backstage to a lot of WWE shows. WWE always opens up their doors to him and lets him in whenever he wants. He's regained a little bit of mobility from what I understand. He might be mostly paralyzed from the waist down at this point. And if you've seen pictures or videos of Droz in recent years, he's got this giant, like this tank of a wheelchair that was built for him. It's almost like a golf cart, four-wheeler wheelchair combination. This thing is enormous. So he's really been able to customize his life for his condition, and despite the fact that he cannot walk, you know, he's led a pretty relatively normal life. He gets to go out, he gets to travel, gets to do things, has plenty of room to move around, and has had a lot of custom-built equipment for his injury. But as you can see, you know, he changed. You know, he doesn't look anything like he used to. Much bigger of a guy now. He's pretty much unrecognizable, but that's to be expected. I mean, a debilitating injury like that, he hasn't walked in 18 years. Think about that. And for that guy to remain positive and to always have a smile on his face, I don't know if I would be that strong. I just don't know. If I was faced with that same situation, I can't promise that I wouldn't be depressed. And so anytime I see anybody suffer something like Droz did, I am so proud of them when they remain positive and make the best of the horrible situation that was handed to them. And Droz definitely did. So my thoughts are always with Droz. I think about him from time to time, especially if I'm watching old footage and I happen to see him. And I'm like, oh yeah, Droz, it's so sad what ended up happening to him. And every now and then I try to check up on him or read about him on the internet or check out social media or try to get any news I can on the guy just to see how he's doing. I've always kept Droz in my thoughts after all these years, because I remember being horrified when I heard the news, and I was going to a lot of shows around this time, right before Droz was injured, maybe like a week before. I was at Unforgiven in 1999 in Charlotte of that year. That was in late September, and I was also at the Raw right after that, the night after, when they did the This Is Your Life segment. I attended both of those shows live. And that was right around the time that this happened to Droz, so just a couple of weeks before. So October 5th has not been the greatest day. We lost Brian Pillman. We had Droz get paralyzed just a couple of years later. But it also marked some pretty incredible things happening as well. An amazing first ever Hell in the Cell match, an iconic match between Shawn Michaels and The Undertaker. Not only did the match itself deliver, but the finish delivered with the debut of Cain and that whole thing, and that storyline getting off and running. And here we are 20 years later, and we are still talking about Cain. So that was a pretty iconic night and a pretty crazy time in not only WWE's history, but wrestling history in general, because there was a lot going on during that time with WWE and WCW and the Monday Night Wars and all of that, especially with Brett packing up and leaving just about a month after this. So tune back in to my channel on November 9th. You'll hear me talk in depth about the Montreal Screwjob and maybe put that whole subject to bed, because I've talked about the Montreal Screwjob countless times over the years in my commentary. So maybe this can be the blow-off. Maybe this can be the final chapter as far as me talking about the Montreal Screwjob, and we'll finally put the whole thing to rest. Thank you very much for listening. I appreciate you spending your time with us tonight and reliving some of these days from 1997 and 1999. If any of you have any memories about this day or some of the things that took place, please leave them in the comments below. Would love to hear your thoughts and your memories and your opinions. And that's going to do it for this episode. Check back with the YouTube channel. Your normal, regular weekly commentaries should be on schedule. I might delay this week's a little bit because this Day in History show falls on the same day that I normally do my commentaries on. So I'll probably delay my next episode maybe a day or two, but that's it. So stay tuned very soon to the YouTube channel and my social media for all the latest updates on all of my content. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll talk to you real soon. Until next time, peace.